So it is that time to
Before you
begin.
dive in, son.
Oh, yeah.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Preview of coming attractions. First of all, thanks to Jimmy for doing this these past 3 weeks, even though I haven't seen either of the first two presentations. I'll review those on YouTube later on. The other piece is next week we start our study of Revelation. I mentioned this in church, but we are going to do a detailed verse by verse run through the book. But we won't start with a detailed verse by verse run through the book the first week. We might not even get to it the second week. I'm trying to get together all the things I want to say as an overview, and so it's going to definitely take at least 1 week. It might take a week and a half, 2 weeks. But we'll probably roughly, if you want a rough guide, we'll probably cover about a chapter a week. There are 22 chapters total. Some chapters are short though, but some like 7 are very short and very rich. But that's just kind of a rule of thumb. But that's the game plan. We'll start that next Sunday. But this Sunday we have session 3 with Jimmy.
Okay, so this session we're going to talk more. We talked last time. If the clicker will even work, and it doesn't. Okay. Okay, so last 2 weeks ago we talked more about Francis's relationship with God, his prayer life. Last week we talked more about his relationship to the world. But this week we're going to talk about his relationship more to his followers. How did he interact with the people that kind of joined his group and became friars and nuns and third orders? But again, I want to just remember who Francis was not. Francis was not a 21st century American. That's really, really important to me because he had a medieval mindset on a lot of things. There's still a lot of things we can learn from him that apply to who we are today, but he was not a 21st century American. He was also not a second Messiah. He was not another Jesus. That's probably a bigger issue for those of us in brown. But it is a danger to try to follow Francis so much that we lose the idea of the bigger picture. So the danger of Francisolatry. And this is going to be especially important for some of those early Franciscans about how do they continue to follow Francis, but ultimately follow Jesus. So, and again, of course, here's a map of Italy. Assisi's here, kind of in the middle, not too far from Rome. But as the followers of Franciscanism started spreading, it took off like wildfire all across Europe and a lot of the world pretty quickly. Again, just to review, Francis's most important thing and his driving ideal in everything he did was to simply live the gospel simply. That is the entire idea. Jesus said, do X, we're going to do X and not make excuses and try to do X minus half. So just radical simplicity in living the gospel. And as he learned more things about what Jesus said, he would keep amending what he was doing. So he would exchange his belt, because Jesus said don't take a belt, so he exchange it for a piece of rope. And again, we talked about what the Franciscan Charism, the gift of Franciscanism. Every group has a different charism, but the specific charism that Franciscans have is to minister to the margins of society. And so they're traditionally known for ministry to the poor specifically. And that's going to be very important because some other groups are studying, doing other things, but Franciscans are known for very active ministry in the world. And Francis was especially. And so we also, because Francis was not a 21st century American, he was not a second Jesus, but Francis lived from 1182 to 1226, again, just like a 44-year lifespan, which is mind-boggling that he did all of this in such a short time. But again, he was a medieval saint who loved Jesus and wanted to live out the gospel in radical simplicity. And he also was the founder of the Order of Friars Minor, as well as the Poor Clares and the Third Order, which this is going to be especially important today. This is really his group of followers that are going to be coming from these three groups. So he was the founder of the three orders: the Order of Friars Minor, the Poor Clares, and the Third Order. And this is kind of going to be the three things that we're going to be discussing today. So first, the first followers, the Order of Friars Minor. In Latin, it's called the Ordo Fratrum Minorum, which we nice to keep the nice abbreviation. We call it the Order of Friars Minor. This is the traditional celibate Catholic group. They are still called the OFM, the Order of Friars Minor, but really, I think the best translation for this group and what Francis was really trying to, in his mind, was to really be the group of little brothers. They're supposed to be the brothers, the little brothers of the church. That was supposed to be their ministry, to help out where they needed to, the group of little brothers. Yeah.
So, not meaning small, but little
younger, yeah. And to be kind of that they're not trying to take the important prestigious, but intentionally taking the minority role.
Maybe lesser.
Lesser, yeah. Younger, lesser, yeah. And Francis's group started, the OFM started as a group of 12, with Francis included. Sometimes they would say that it was 13 because they wanted to have like 12 apostles plus Francis, but that again starts getting into the Francisolatry stuff. But it was really a group of 12. When they went to go meet with the Pope for the first rule, there was a group of 12, which was amazing that he even had that group in the early time. But within about 10 years, this group grew to about 5,000 in 10 years. So it was an amazing jumping off point. But Francis didn't know what to do. Francis had no idea. He was not expecting to start a new religious order. He was just trying to live the gospel like God said and just minister to people that God brought to him. But he saw the brothers that were starting to come to him being attracted to also emulate what he did in his life themselves. And so Francis, of course, saw them as gifts from God, and he just tried to love them and try to include them in however that would work. But again, Francis wanted all the brothers to minister in their own ways and not to try to be exactly like Francis. But they did start a small, good group together. But within 10 years, once they started getting approval from Rome, from the Pope, and as things started growing, started getting more and more friars, things started getting more bureaucratic. The first rule that Francis wrote, the primitive rule, was just a bunch of citations from Scripture. Nothing else, nothing about how to live or anything else except for what Romans says or St. Paul says in 1 Timothy, nothing outside of that. But because there were more and more people, Francis had to start making more and more rules at the Pope's asking to actually solidify a better position. Because when it's only 12 people living together and working together, that's one thing. But when you start having thousands that are joining this group, oh, yes.
Growth to 5,000 during Francis's lifetime?
Yes. Yeah. He has to, which is part of this, he has to start setting up more bureaucratic rules, and he has to start delegating a lot of the work to a lot of other people and how he's running it. So yeah, he actually would have to let's go all the way. So yeah, he had to start delegating as the group kept growing. He had to start setting up friaries in different parts of Europe. We also talked about how he would go to the Holy Land. He ended up having to set up a group there to keep the Holy Land going, the custody of the Holy Land. So he had to allow the ministers or the custodians or guardians to actually run the Franciscan order. And he kind of would step back a little bit from that. And so he would kind of like direct the ministers and kind of give advice to them, but he would let them do the running of the ministry.
So I'm trying to think
Yeah.
medieval times. What was the draw that brought all of these people into the Franciscans?
I think it was because the Franciscans were living a holy life, and Francis was living a holy life, and it was just different. That it was what Jesus was saying, that the Franciscans were living out the gospel like Jesus said. They had been hearing on Sunday mornings. So these were all, of course, in Europe. They were at least nominally Christian. So these were actually people that took their faith very seriously. That didn't mean they had to go hide in a monastery necessarily for at least a minute. That'll be a different case in a minute for the poor players. But they actually would go minister, and they would go all over the place. The Franciscans, because they were an active group, an active ministry, and they weren't tied to a specific monastery, they were very quickly to be deployed as necessary by the church hierarchy. And they could send messages very quickly. We need you to take a message from Assisi to Germany or over to Spain really quickly and go help start a ministry over there. So it was very quick.
It's like felt the love from him, and it was more, instead of, sitting back and judging some of the poor, some of the needy, this is how we love them.
Exactly, yeah, I think so. And there were some bad apples in the group, of course. There were some people that were doing it like any other time because they wanted to wear, I don't know how this would be flashy, but kind of the flashy robes. So they were doing it for the wrong reasons. And there's still Franciscans and other people that are in the groups that are doing it for all the wrong reasons.
So they're pious?
Yeah, pious and kind of wanting to get authority, if that makes sense, which is exactly 100% exactly the opposite of what Francis wanted. The brown was supposed to put you at the low end of everything. And within 100 years, there's actually a battle about after Francis died, but within 100 years after his death, there were some people that thought that the brown habit looked too poor, and so they wanted to change it. And eventually, it was like, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, we'll change the hood a little bit we'll separate the hood so that's a little bit different, so that we're unique. But that makes no sense if we're trying to be that's our charism, is to minister to the poor. Why would we change that? So the Franciscans would have a bunch of these little debates that never happened in any other order about clothing. But one of the other important things, as Francis was setting up these to let other people delegate ministry, he would go and step back from his active ministry, because he was very active in ministering to whoever in whatever capacity and working in the fields for various trades. So he would, from time to time, he would just get overwhelmed by stuff. And so he would step back and go to the hermitage, and he would live as a hermit for a little bit. And kind of change, his prayer life would change a little bit. But he would step back from his active ministry. And he actually wrote a separate rule for people that needed to go to the hermitage, that it should be a small group of people that can kind of live together and care for each other. But part of that is that Francis realized that that things change sometimes, that the spiritual needs for people change from time to time, that what's good one day is not going to be helpful 3 weeks from now. And he knew that himself. And so even though the ideal is to do active ministry 100% to the poor all the time, that's not feasible. We're not Jesus. We're not perfect. Even Jesus still stepped back and drew back and took Sunday naps sometimes on the boat. So, but Francis would draw back and live as a hermit as he needed to, and that was part of it. To be spiritually, be able to do what you need to do spiritually, I think was very helpful. And Francis would keep writing different rules as they needed to happen, because Francis, and one of the most important things I think Francis did, is that Francis knew if something changed, if the situation changed in some way, it's okay to let it change. If things need to be adapted, that's fine. That doesn't necessarily make that the ideal situation, but if the rule needs to change somewhat because the situation, the brothers need something done, that's okay. like pointing. I think we discussed this last week, but part of it, Francis originally asked the brothers to work only to trade shelter or food or something along those lines. He said, do not trade your time and your labor, literally working in the fields. If you're working for somebody in the field, ask for food or for shelter for the day, and that's good, but not for money, at least originally. But Francis later realized that because some friars are aging and they're having to be taken care of by the rest of the community, that there was the friars would need some sort of way to do that. And so it was okay, not necessarily his preferred way, but it was okay for them to work for money in that instance, if they were needing to take care of the rest of the community. So I think that is probably still his most helpful, that he changed as he needed to, and he would draw back at just about the time that they were starting to write the second rule. He would start drawing back from his super active ministry, but he was still very, very active and preaching as well. Another change and amendment of his idea is his relationship with St. Anthony. And before I say that, though, one of the things that we have, or Francis did write some things, not much. Almost his entire writings that we have is that much. And the vast majority, a few of them are prayers like we talked about, but the vast majority of his writings are the rules he set up for the brothers, and as well as the letters that he sent out to various ministers, to the clergy in the order. And so most of what we have are not him sitting down and thinking wonderful thoughts about things. They are letters and admonitions to other people in the order about doing. Y'all should clean up the altar because it's getting really, especially those that are working at churches, y'all need to clean up what the altar looks like. It's kind of getting in disrepair, so you'll need to clean that up. But one of the things that Francis did change on, and we have a lot of short letters that Francis wrote to people. He probably wrote tons more, but those are the ones that people saved and we still have. And so that's actually what most of that book is. It's like long commentary by scholars and then short letter from Francis. And that's the vast majority of it. But Francis, one of the early Franciscans was actually St. Anthony of Padua. He was an Augustinian before this, but he was very educated in theology, but that just wasn't cutting it. So he found the Franciscans, and he was already a priest. And Francis originally didn't want priests in his order because of the education issue, but because he thought that those that were educated were haughty and arrogant, which that's an issue that I have sometimes. So I can understand why that would be a concern of his. But Francis originally didn't want priests in the order because of the education issue. But Francis met St. Anthony, and St. Anthony, he was also very early in being canonized as a saint. And this is the same San Antonio. This is the St. Anthony that San Antonio was named after. But St. Anthony was educated, but that didn't deter him from being humble in how he interacted with everyone. So Francis said that priests were okay, theological education was okay, but that St. Anthony was going to teach them. And so he was kind of diverted all of that. So St. Anthony, though he was just a priest, Francis wrote a letter towards the end of Francis's life, which is here. Brother Francis sends his wishes of health to Brother Anthony, my bishop. It pleases me that you teach sacred theology to the brothers, as long as, in the words of the rule, you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion with study of this kind. There's also a slight dig at Dominicans in this too. Dominicans were the other group that was kind of starting out. There's always been a big rivalry between Dominicans and Franciscans. Francis and Dominic met each other and got along, but Dominicans and Franciscans kind of had a nice rivalry ever since. But Dominicans, their main charism is study and preaching. And Franciscans do some studying sometimes. Franciscans are known for preaching as well, but those are secondary to the main charism of ministry to the poor. But in the Dominican, sometimes you can get in the Dominican idea, if you are studying so much about God and about everything else and working on great theology, then you can kind of take that off as your prayer time. And Francis was basically, which is not necessarily a horrible thing if your studying is bringing you closer to God, but Francis did not want the study, especially if you're thinking very intellectually about everything, to get in way of the devotion and prayer time with God. So that's kind of it. He also calls Anthony the bishop, even though he was just a priest, but because he was having to kind of run all of the bishop or all of the priests in the group, so he was kind of having an overseeing position in the Franciscan order at that time. But I think we have almost as much, if not more, writings from his sermons and stuff, of Anthony's sermons. We know Francis preached, we know his sermons were great, that they were very moving, lots of people came to listen to them. We have stories about his sermons, like the sermon on Christmas Eve. We do not have a single sermon of his written down, even in like a lecture outline. We have none of that. We have Anthony's sermons, at least outlines of them, and some of them in text. Some of them might have been a little bit elaborated than what they really were. But we have his sermons, so that's fun. Okay, so that's the OFM. His first followers were the guys, because they were the ones that were kind of able to just join in and do whatever he was doing quickly. But Francis also had a person named Claire that started hanging out, a woman. And if Claire was also from Assisi, she was also from a noble family. They kind of had parallel lives. She was 12 years younger than he was, but she lived 27 years longer than he did. I think if my math is right, yeah. So, but Francis and Claire, there's sometimes some stories like Francis and Claire really had a romantic relationship or something along those lines. I don't think that's the case at all. It was a good platonic relationship that they had together, that they cared for each other as co-founders of what would become the Poor Clares. But Claire wanted to join Francis. Claire heard Francis preaching in Assisi because that was her hometown, that was his hometown, and she wanted to join him and the other friars in their ministry to the poor, get out there to work with those at the margin. And she had family drama too. Of course, the family wasn't okay with that. So they wanted her at home. They wanted to marry her off, get a dowry, and get her married off to a good family. Francis knew this wasn't going to be an option, really. What they were doing in the world was too dangerous. And again, this was medieval Europe, so they were not a good place for a woman to be in that time. Later, an uncle was able to kind of resolve the family stuff and let her be. But yeah, she was not able to just jump into the. She would try to jump in with the active ministry, just follow around, but especially one woman with 13, 15 guys is not necessarily the best thing at that time either. So Francis and Claire together devised and created a system, another order, a second order in the Franciscan movement, where Claire and other women could live the Franciscan Charism, could minister to the poor, but in a convent, so that was a little bit safer for them, if that makes sense. So Francis, again, this is one of those Francis realizing that what the ideal should be and how to amend that to make it plausible for other people. And Claire was brilliant. She probably would have started another order of her own, even if Francis wasn't around. But because Francis and she were together, they were able to start what would become the Poor Clares. So this was, and they're the nuns of the Franciscan order. They're technically like the Order of St. Clare, Order of St. Francis, usually. They're colloquially called the Poor Clares. So, but they still would live the Franciscan Charism. They would often take care of the like making vestments for the friars, making some other stuff, doing whatever they could inside the convent, right around the convent to help. St. Clare was actually sick a lot of times, so she would do whatever she could from her sick bed. And then the Benedictines also gave them an abandoned monastery and chapel to start this convent ministry called the Portiuncula. And it's all the decorations happen much later. They've got art from all over the place, but this was just kind of a rundown chapel and monastery that's just kind of sitting out there. The Benedictines didn't need it, so they just donated it, which is why the Benedictines and the Franciscans have always had a good relationship together, unlike some other groups. But this is called, and just in case it's normally called the Portiuncula, which I think means like little house. But the technical religious title is Our Lady of the Angels. That's what the monastery and chapel are called. Our Lady of the Angels. And another Southwestern history in the U.S. because Franciscans were all over the Southwestern United States. This would end up becoming the name for one of the biggest cities in California. The technical name for that city was La Ciudad de la Reina de Los Angeles, or now Los Angeles. But it is named for the
City of the Queen of the Angels.
City of the Queen of the Angels, yeah. So this is, but now just the Angels. So, but it is named for a major, even though it doesn't seem Franciscan, it is named for a Franciscan church. So they did their ministry there. They would make other monasteries elsewhere. If you see Claire's habit, she's basically wearing as close as you can get to a nun version of what Francis has on. Sometimes they wear so the brown tunic and the brown robe are pretty common to every Franciscan, and then the guys usually have a hood, but they would usually wear scapular and then a veil, which are the nun components. And because the Poor Clares are often considered the more contemplative branch of the Franciscan community. There are contemplative groups of guys as well, but the nuns are usually, by and large, the more contemplative group. And the community that I belong to, in case you're curious, is technically the community of Francis and Clare, because Clare was such an important role in early Franciscan community. That's our logo. So that's because Clare and our group does have men and women. It's the 21st century in the Episcopal Church, and so we do recognize both as important founders of Franciscan ideals. And Francis and Clare were slightly different. Clare has wonderful contemplative writings, which is the rest of this book, and rules and letters. But they kind of form this. So, any questions so far? It's a tall cross up there. It's a tau cross, yeah. Tau crosses kind of just look like a T, but Francis heard a sermon from a pope about the letter tau and the importance of the tau, and the tau is a cross. And so Francis started saying, I'm going to start signing my name with that, the tau cross, and he started actually using it for just about, and it became an early Franciscan symbol as well. The rest of the church sometimes uses it, sometimes not, but the tau cross is a Franciscan symbol, and so sometimes Franciscans are left. But
T-A-U.
Yeah. T-A-U.
It's the Greek letter T. It's also what crosses most likely look like. The average cross you would usually see an execution on would usually be tau shaped, not Latin shaped or certainly not Greek shaped.
No.
Occasionally X's, occasionally other things, but the tau cross was the dominant form of the cross.
Yeah. So the tau cross, very popular in Franciscan everything. Even today, you can usually find tau crosses in usually means some affinity of some sort to Franciscan something. Brings to the next group, Francis and the Third Order. So the Third Order is is for people that are trying to live the Franciscan Charism, and was designed for people that were living the Franciscan Charism as lay people. That would later include priests, but it was originally made for people that were already married, had positions, had jobs, and they weren't able to just drop everything and go live as a friar or a nun. So Francis in this group was originally known as the Brothers and Sisters of Penance, or the good medieval name for something, the Order of Penance. But Francis originally traditionally made this group for Lucius Modestini and his wife Buonadonna. Sisters, even if you look in the practices. But they were a married couple that were trying to get more in line with the gospel themselves, trying to figure out what to do and how to live what Jesus said. But they were already married, so him running off to be a friar and her running off to a convent might have been a possibility, but Francis didn't want them to get divorced or to try to have their marriage annulled. And Francis didn't want to cause that issue. So he created a third order because you already have the first order of the OFM, second order of the Poor Clares, and then you get the third order for everyone else. So Francis created a separate order, the third order, and wrote a rule with the help of a cardinal about how to live these ideals in normal life. This rule has changed over time, but at the time, Francis said, don't take up arms, don't carry weapons with you. And that was a big deal back then because a lot of princes would want their people to go to battle in the Crusades and other battles. But Francis, and that actually got them in trouble with a lot of political authorities. But Francis said, you're not going to be able to take up arms because just don't, basically. Francis also said you can have meat sometimes, but really save it for the high holy days, for Sundays, and don't eat it because of the class, the socioeconomic class issue of eating meat was more of a rich thing. So don't do that most of the time. Also, they allowed them, the third order, to wear a form of the habit. It wasn't exactly this. They wore a brown scapular, usually had a robe that they would wear. That's kept getting confusing and getting in the way. So over time, the third order usually would wear like a robe under their other clothes, or wear some other sort of cross as a sign that they were Franciscans. But they would usually not wear the full-blown Franciscan habit. Some third orders actually they're buried, even though they don't wear it in life, they are buried in their death because they lived these Franciscan ideals their whole life. And these are very, very popular too. And so this third order spread like wildfire. It took off because this was a way for people that, without giving up everything, they were able to still live and live the Franciscan Charism in the world. And priests, there were some priests that would end up also joining this group too, some clergy. These and take some semi-modified vows. They wouldn't take the full vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, because you can't really do that if you're still married or living in the world. Because Franciscan friars would not be allowed to own property, but third orders would need to in order to just live. So yeah, these groups spread all over the place really quickly. And actually, the Franciscan third order was actually the first third order. The other groups, like the Augustinians, Dominicans, the preaching and studying one, teaching, They would also create third orders, but Francis was the first one to come up with something for any third orders, and everyone else would base theirs on that. Oh, but on the one thing on the habit too, because they usually wouldn't wear a habit externally, third orders towards the end would usually say just to wear modest clothing, to wear plain clothing, don't be flashy about it when possible, because there's going to be an example about that in a second. But to be modest in your dress and not wear silks and everything. So there are some very popular and famous third orders, people of third orders. I think these are probably the most. Elizabeth of Hungary. Elizabeth of Hungary is one of the co-patron saints of the third order. She was right around the time of Francis. She was growing up as Francis was dying, basically around that time period. But she was a princess in Hungary. She realized for political reasons she was going to have to be married, and she was, but she did have a heart for ministry to the poor, and so that kind of stuck with her, and she ended up becoming one of the first third orders in the time frame or in early generations. So she's actually one of the co-patron saints of the third order. The other one is these other three people are actually, I'll come back to King Louis in a sec, but they're supposedly third orders. The Franciscans like to put them on their calendar as third orders, and we like to think that they're third orders. There's sometimes not evidence, great evidence for them, or at least exact evidence that they were. But Dante Alighieri, he has a lot of stuff about Franciscans in the, as well as other religious groups, but a lot of stuff about Franciscans in the Divine Comedy, in his Divine Comedy, Inferno, Paradiso, Purgatorio. So Franciscans like to count him as a third order. Thomas More, who was the Chancellor of England at the time of King Henry VIII, who was killed because he did not want to be okay with the divorce and the annulment of the marriage. He was definitely a super devout, pious in a good sense man. He wore a hair shirt underneath because he realized he needed to wear the nice regal clothing out on the outside because he just had to fit in with the rest of the court, the royal court. But he would usually wear a hair shirt and other uncomfortable clothing on the inside just to remind him that's not what he's really about. He can put it on the externals if he needs to just to play the games, but on the interior for his spirituality, he wore uncomfortable clothing just to remind him of that. And Pope John the 23rd is actually the most recent Franciscan Pope we've had. He was a third order, and he was the Pope that started Vatican II. He didn't finish it out. He died pretty early, but he was the Pope that started Vatican II, Second Vatican Council. He was a third order Pope. Pope Francis canonized him. But Pope Francis, even though he took Francis as his name, is actually a Jesuit, which is completely out there. King Louis IX is also King Louis IX is the second co-patron saint of the third order. He's a Saint Louis of France, and on the Catholic calendar as well. He was
the big church in New Orleans and the city of Mississippi and Missouri.
Yeah. So, but Saint Louis was definitely a wonderful, devout Christian king. He definitely lived out Franciscan ideals in his ministry and everything in his life as much as he could as a king. But he was they did live them out. There's real question because he was fairly contemporary with St. Francis if he actually would have converted or would have made the vows as a third order. If that would have been possible at the time. So definitely supposedly, but he's one of the two patrons. They're the two patron saints of the third order. Claire's the patron saint of the second order, the poor Claire's. Francis, of course, is the patron saint of the OFM. But one of my favorite paintings is actually from a 17th century painter of King Louis. Is actually a 17th century a Spanish painter called Pacheco. And if you can see there, he's decked out in all of his royal, regal clothing, except at the bottom, beneath everything else, he's in a Franciscan tunic and cord. Is it at least in good thought, he was Franciscan at the court. So, and this is one of those things that, and one side note, sometimes the third order Franciscans are sometimes able to live Franciscan ideals better than the OFM or the Poor Clares, because one of the important things was living the gospel out in the world. Sometimes the third order, the the traditional Franciscan friars do live out in the world, minister in the world in some way, but the third order are really out in the world. So I think they're one of the most famous current Franciscan writers is Father Richard Rohr. He is an OFM, but he wrote in one of his books on Francis that sometimes actually the people that follow and emulate Francis are actually lay people. Some of them in the third order, sometimes not even in the third order, but they are living Franciscan ideals better than sometimes the OFM are and the traditional Franciscan friars. So just because people aren't in the brown, haven't taken the brown, doesn't mean that they're not following Francis and living Francis's charism. So I think that's just about it.
So let me ask that much about Franciscan missionaries in the Americas.
Not much, but
Just, so most of us, the nearest Franciscan monasteries we're going to see are the missions in San Antonio or the ruins of the ones in New Mexico. So, talk to us a little about how it got a little more institutionalized and organized in the monasteries. And that kind of thing.
So technically Franciscans live in, because they're not monks, they're mendicants, they're beggars, and they're friars, not monks, technically, even though I usually say that I'm a monk to some people on the streets just to make the conversation quicker. They live in friaries, which means they do have some sort of house where they can kind of all live together. So Franciscans do have friaries, do have houses where they live together. And so they do have those built up around all over the place. But it did become institutional because there were a bunch of Franciscans all over the place that you started wanting to have groups. You still would be able to send them all over the place, but they weren't because they just weren't in one monastery. But Brother Bob might be at this friary, but he might need to go spend some time at the friary in Levelland or in Amarillo. So we'll send him to Amarillo for a little bit, and then he's actually on his way to Oklahoma City or something. So you can kind of spot check them or send them from point to point. But because it became also institutionalized, some Franciscans were missionaries. They were not as good missionaries as the Jesuits were. The Jesuits were sent all over the place because they were directly under the Pope. Franciscans were under the Pope, not under local bishops, they were under the Pope after their own Franciscan ministers. So it was kind of a little bit more tiered up. But if you actually, in the Latin American and colonial, or in Southwest United States and everything, they kind of actually divvied Spain and the religious orders and Portugal divvied up where the different religious orders could go. So most of Mexico and most of Latin America, the Franciscans were not at, period, at all. The Franciscans really were only allowed to go into the Yucatan, which is like Cozumel and all that place, that area down at the tip of Mexico. So they were allowed to go there. They were also allowed to go to southwestern United States and to kind of take over that area. So that's why all over southwestern United States, that's why all of the missions in San Antonio are Franciscan. The Dominicans and the Jesuits basically took over most of Latin America. It became institutional, and the Franciscans were not necessarily, sadly, the nicest about things sometimes. About converting some of the what's his name? Junipero Serra, which, not to get into any political questions, but Junipero Serra, who was one of the Catholic saints recently canonized, was also one of the people in San Diego who started the mission system. He sometimes did some things, sometimes didn't do great things. He's been in the news a lot because they're trying to take down his statues in those areas because of some of the things that he did that weren't necessarily the best. But he was also a Franciscan, and there were some other Franciscans. I think his name Sana Sagun. I think the person that there was a Mayan codex. They actually that had all of the stories about the Maya. They read that, and a Franciscan friar basically copied some of it and reinterpreted some of it, and then got rid of the actual original, which is terrifying in archaeological and cultural studies to think that they were trying to convert the people, and so we're gonna copy down some of it to hold on to it so we know where these people are coming from. We're just gonna get rid of the original and hold on to our copy. So it was not necessarily the best thing on all accounts.
I missed the class. I'm sure
Yeah.
but how did you move out from Franciscan?
So part of it, it's complicated. My job that I have, I think, is partly I work as a paralegal in an immigration law firm. So that's part of it. But I also serve in some ministries elsewhere. I don't have tons of time to do some of the stuff that I'd like to do, but that just happens with life. But part of the rule too that we talked about, or that I mentioned, is the importance of praying the daily office and everything, and making sure to at least pray at those times, whether or not it's actually the daily office or something else. So that's part of the rule of life, is to pray at those times of the daily office. So that's important to that. Yeah, we have a whole complete separate rule that's kind of drawing on other things, but we have to maintain, because we're not in a traditional community, we have to maintain our own jobs and other stuff. Yeah. So there is a obscure or semi-obscure, but it's an obscure reference in Luke, I think, when Jesus is sending out the disciples. Says, don't take extra tunics and don't wear a belt. Don't even take a belt. And so it's from when Jesus was commissioning some of the disciples in the middle of Luke. And Francis, before that, was wearing the tunic and everything, but he had a belt on, and he talked to the priest afterwards. And he's like, Father, what does Jesus mean and say? Because he understood some Latin, but wasn't necessarily the best. So they were looking at what Jesus actually said, and he was like, well, Jesus says don't wear a belt. Not gonna wear a belt even. But we still need to cinch this up, because trying to work in this is without a belt it kind of gets everywhere. So put a rope on. And also because Franciscans are usually at some sort of active ministry too. Franciscans are known to roll up their sleeves more than other religious orders are. Yeah.
So Jimmy, do you have a boss in your structure in Lubbock as a friar?
I don't. There's nobody else in Lubbock. The next closest person now is Galveston.
And that's your boss?
No.
Okay.
We had a work. Yeah. So I'm a novice, a second year novice. After 2 years of novitiate, 2 years of being a novice, you can make profession of life vows. So God willing and nothing changing, I'm going to do that in June. And I get to wear a fancy San Damiano cross. Not really that fancy, but they add that. But then we have what's called a guardian. Again, because Franciscans are kind of doing the ministry. The important thing is, in some other, like Father Abbot or the Abbess. The superiors have lots of power, lots of prestige, and the Franciscans come together and elect, like the monks, they elect, but you elect a guardian, and they are there mostly for pastoral reasons.
Is that kind of who you're accountable to?
Kind of, but it's kind of more complicated because we're spread out so much. So we're more accountable to our
Around
local
you.
church and yeah.
But you also have a small group that you're part of within
Yeah.
the order.
Yeah, so we do meet a lot for, we have a small group that we meet with cluster. Most everything takes place by Zoom. But we meet, everyone meets once a month by Zoom. Then we meet for formation, which is more about transformation in life than it is about education formation. But we meet with those, and then we also meet with a small group just to make sure that we have that close bond because we are so far out and that we are still family. Yeah.
So, they looked at it in Catholic Franciscans and do they ever cross or do?
Yeah, actually, Franciscan, because of the way Francis lived, and that it's kind of bizarre. Franciscans are actually probably one of the more ecumenical groups that doesn't mind joining together. There are a lot of ecumenical meetings of Franciscans around the church. There's Lutheran Franciscans, there's an ecumenical Franciscan group that's separate completely, but there are some of my Franciscan brothers and sisters have been on committees with some of the, they have local Francis, like in New York, they have a Franciscan meeting that's Franciscans, Catholics, Episcopalians, all over the place. They don't mind being more ecumenical.
And some of the Benedictines have been
Yeah.
able to do that too,
Yeah.
across denominational lines. Like the Benedictine monastery in Michigan also has that, they hosted some Buddhist monks that were homeless for a while, and so there's a little shrine that the monks donated this tucked away in the woods, which is really cute. But anyway, so they sometimes can play well with each other.
So did you say you're the only Franciscan in Lubbock?
Well, I'm the only one in my group in Lubbock.
Of this
There's
Episcopal
of
group.
this Episcopal group.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, there's and there are other third orders. There's actually a couple people at St. Chris that are third order Franciscans in a different Episcopal group. There's a group of Franciscan sisters in Wolford that I know of. But that's
Roman Catholic.
Roman Catholic.
The mission on the Navajo reservation, those are Franciscans.
I don't know about after Spanish history, so I don't. They could very well be, but I don't know.
Yeah, now they're Episcopalians.
Yeah.
Post 1870s, 1880s, the Navajo and the Sioux got drawn by the Episcopalians.
Well, but we go to a Catholic mission, so it's Catholic.
Okay, they have a,
Yeah, so they
Okay.
come,
Okay.
and I think that the sister there is.
Could be.
Anyway.
If they're wearing brown, they're Franciscans. If they're not wearing
Well,
brown,
they don't,
they could be in regular street clothes too. That's
yeah, they were street, and I figured they were street clothes because of,
Yeah.
like climbing on the roof, or, just I don't know. But when I go, very soon in 2 weeks. I'll have a discussion.
well, we better draw to a closer. Thanks to Jimmy for doing this for 3 weeks. Next week, we'll start the book of Revelation, though we won't get to the text for a week and a half.